Have you ever been punished just for knowing more than you were supposed to? Imagine being in class, correcting your teacher with facts, only to be silenced and sent home. But what happens when the school realizes they messed with the wrong family? When a powerful man arrives in the most unforgettable way, the system is forced to listen. Watch till the end to see how one student changed everything. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Cameron Bennett had always loved mornings on the farm. The hum of the irrigation system, the scent of damp soil, and the sight of his father checking the AI-powered crop monitors were all part of his daily life. But today was different. He wasn't in the fields. Instead, he was headed to Brookdale Middle School, excited for science class. Today's lesson was about American agriculture, a topic he knew better than anyone in the room. Farming wasn't just something he read about. It was in his blood. His family's farm thrived not by following old methods but by embracing cutting-edge technology, drones for soil analysis, automated irrigation, and data-driven crop rotation. As he stepped into Mr. Stephen Caldwell's classroom, the usual scent of chalk and old textbooks filled the air. Mr. Caldwell, a strict teacher who never strayed from the curriculum, adjusted his glasses and began writing on the board. Today, we'll discuss how corporate farming has replaced small farms, he announced. Open your textbooks to page 112. Cameron flipped through the pages, but as he scanned the content, his stomach tightened. The book claimed traditional farms were dying out, that small farmers couldn't compete, and that crop rotation was outdated. His hands curled into fists. This wasn't true. He raised his hand. Sir, that's not accurate. My family's farm is thriving because we use modern technology, drones, AI sensors, and GPS-guided tractors. Small farms aren't disappearing. They're innovating. A few students turned, whispering. Mr. Caldwell sighed and shook his head. Cameron, I appreciate your perspective, but we'll stick to what's in the textbook. But the textbook is outdated, Cameron insisted. It doesn't even mention precision farming or new irrigation techniques. The room fell silent. Mr. Caldwell's expression hardened. Cameron, if you can't respect the lesson, you can leave. Cameron's heart pounded. He wasn't a troublemaker, but he couldn't just sit there and let misinformation spread. With a deep breath, he grabbed his backpack and stood up. As he walked toward the door, he had no idea that this was only the beginning. Cameron sat stiffly in his chair, gripping his textbook. His heart was still racing from the first exchange, but he refused to let it go. This wasn't about proving a point, it was about correcting false information. Mr. Caldwell exhaled heavily and continued as if nothing had happened. Now, as I was saying, corporate farming has become the dominant force in American agriculture. Traditional small farms are struggling to keep up, and many are being phased out due to the rise of large-scale agribusiness. Cameron's hand shot up again. The teacher pinched the bridge of his nose before calling on him. Yes, Cameron. That's not entirely true, sir, Cameron said, keeping his voice steady. Small farms aren't being wiped out, they're adapting. My family's farm uses GPS-guided tractors, drone-assisted planting, and AI-powered soil monitoring to compete with corporate farms. We're not struggling, we're thriving. A few students turned their heads, exchanging looks. Some whispered, others smirked. They could feel the tension rising. Mr. Caldwell's expression hardened. Cameron, I understand that your family owns a farm, but this class follows scientifically backed research. The experts who wrote this textbook have spent years studying these trends. But the textbook is outdated, Cameron argued. It doesn't even mention precision agriculture, automated irrigation, or AI-driven crop rotation, things that are common in modern farming. If we're going to learn about agriculture, shouldn't we at least have accurate information? A few quiet chuckles echoed through the room. Someone muttered, "Here we go again." Mr. Caldwell's patience was wearing thin. Cameron, while I appreciate your enthusiasm, you are disrupting my class. If you have concerns, take them up after the lesson. Cameron felt his frustration boiling over. So we're just supposed to sit here and accept incorrect information because it's in a book? The room fell silent. Some students held back laughter. Others looked wide-eyed between Cameron and Mr. Caldwell. The teacher's face reddened. His jaw tightened. Enough, Cameron. I will not have you undermining my lesson. I'm not undermining anything, Cameron countered. I'm correcting misinformation. Isn't that what school is supposed to teach us, to think critically? A few students exchanged glances. He had a point. Mr. Caldwell's fingers gripped the edge of his desk. This is my classroom and I decide what is taught here. If you refuse to respect that, you can leave. Cameron's pulse hammered in his ears. He had two choices: back down and accept a lie, or stand his ground and face the consequences. With a deep breath, he grabbed his backpack and stood up. He could feel every pair of eyes on him as he walked toward the door. Mr. Caldwell pointed at the exit. Go to the principal's office. Now. The hallway was eerily quiet as Cameron walked toward the administrative office. His footsteps echoed against the tiled floor, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't disrespectful. But here he was, being treated like he had broken the rules. All he had done was tell the truth. The office smelled like disinfectant and old paperwork. Mrs. Dunlap, the school secretary, barely looked up. Mr. Caldwell already called, she said, pointing at a chair. Take a seat. Cameron sat down, bouncing his knee anxiously. Principal Douglas Harper was a tall man with a no-nonsense attitude. He was known for prioritizing discipline over fairness. After a few minutes, the door creaked open. Come in, Principal Harper said. Cameron stepped inside, sitting across from him. Cameron, Harper sighed. Tell me what happened. Cameron kept his voice even. I corrected something in class and Mr. Caldwell got upset. Harper rubbed his temples. Did you raise your voice? No. Did you argue after being told to stop? I told him the textbook was wrong, Cameron said. Because it is, Harper sighed. Look, I'm not saying you're wrong, but in a classroom setting you have to respect the teacher's authority. Cameron's jaw clenched. Even if he's teaching something that isn't true. Harper hesitated. There's a time and place for those discussions. Cameron shook his head. He wasn't going to listen. He laughed at me. Before Harper could respond, the door opened again. Mr. Caldwell stepped inside. His arms were crossed, his expression tight. I see we're still debating this, he muttered. Principal Harper looked between them. Mr. Caldwell, is this worth suspension? Cameron's stomach dropped. Suspension. Mr. Caldwell hesitated, then nodded. I think a firm consequence is needed, Harper exhaled. Cameron, I'm sending you home for the rest of the day. We'll discuss further action tomorrow. Cameron's jaw tightened. This wasn't fair. Harper raised a hand. It's not about fair, Cameron. It's about structure. Cameron stood, his fists clenched at his sides. Arguing wouldn't change anything. A few minutes later, his mother arrived. As they walked to the car, she didn't say anything at first, but as they pulled out of the parking lot, she finally spoke. You want to explain why I had to leave work for this? She asked. Cameron stared out the window. I told the truth. And now he was paying the price for it. Cameron sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his fingers clenched around his backpack strap as the car moved steadily down the road. The silence between him and his mother was heavy. He could feel the tension, the unspoken words simmering just beneath the surface. Finally, his mother, Renee Bennett, let out a slow breath. You want to tell me why I had to leave work for this? She asked, her voice measured but tight. Cameron stared out the window, watching the blurred trees pass by. I told the truth, he said simply. Renee's hands tightened around the steering wheel. Cameron, I'm not saying you were wrong, she said, glancing at him, but there's a way to handle things. Challenging your teacher in the middle of class, what did you think was going to happen? He was teaching false information, Mom. I wasn't going to sit there and let him act like small farms don't exist anymore. That's our life. That's our family. Renee sighed, shaking her head. I get it. I really do, but you have to pick your battles. Cameron clenched his jaw. That was the problem. He hadn't chosen this battle. It had been forced on him the moment his teacher dismissed his knowledge like it didn't matter. By the time they pulled into the long driveway leading to the Bennett farm, his frustration was boiling over. The family farm stretched across hundreds of acres, a mixture of golden cotton fields, rows of soybeans, and sprawling grazing pastures. The high-tech irrigation system hummed in the background, the drone stationed near the barn ready for daily crop monitoring. Cameron barely had time to unbuckle before the front door swung open. His father, Marcus Bennett, stood on the porch, arms crossed, his broad shoulders tense with anger. They suspended you. Marcus demanded the moment Cameron stepped out of the car. Renee closed the driver's door with more force than necessary. For disrupting class, she confirmed, her tone sharp. Marcus's nostrils flared. So let me get this straight. My son knew more than his teacher and they punished him for it. Cameron finally let out the frustration that had been bubbling inside him. I wasn't disrespectful. I didn't yell. I just corrected him and he didn't like it. Marcus ran a hand over his beard, his frustration evident. You mean to tell me that in 2025 we're still punishing kids for being smarter than the people teaching them? Renee groaned. Marcus, don't start. Marcus's eyes flashed. No, I will start, Renee. Because this is ridiculous. He gets sent home for telling the truth. What kind of lesson does that teach him? That sometimes the world isn't fair, Renee shot back. Yeah, and maybe sometimes the world needs to be reminded who they're messing with. A deep voice cut in. Everyone turned. Standing at the top of the porch steps, dressed in dark slacks and a crisp button-down shirt, was Walter Bennett. Cameron's grandfather wasn't a man who raised his voice. He didn't have to. When Walter Bennett spoke, people listened. A retired Air Force colonel and a self-made millionaire, Walter had taken what was once a struggling farm and turned it into an agricultural empire. He commanded respect wherever he went, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. Walter stepped down from the porch, his polished boots crunching against the gravel as he studied Cameron with a calm, calculating gaze. They really sent you home for knowing more than your teacher, Cameron nodded. Yeah. Walter let out a slow breath, shaking his head. You know, boy, in my time we used to call that a coward's move. Marcus smirked, but Renee shot him a look. Walter turned to Cameron fully, crossing his arms. So what are you going to do about it? Cameron blinked. What do you mean? Walter smirked. I mean, do you want them to just get away with it? Because I sure as hell don't. Cameron felt his stomach flip. His grandfather was never one for small fights. If Walter Bennett was stepping in, this wasn't small anymore. Marcus exhaled. Dad, what are you thinking? Walter cracked his knuckles. I'm thinking that if they wanted to send a message by suspending my grandson, then maybe it's time we send one back. Cameron woke up to a sound he had never expected. A deep, rhythmic whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Rotor blades. He bolted upright in bed, his heart racing. Jumping out of bed, he ran to the window. The sky was still painted with soft streaks of morning light, but right in the middle of their farmland, dust was swirling, leaves rustling, animals shifting restlessly. A black helicopter was descending onto their property. Cameron barely had time to process what was happening before he heard the front door swing open downstairs. Rushing out of his room, he skidded to a halt at the top of the staircase, just in time to see his grandfather buttoning his suit jacket and adjusting his cuffs. Walter Bennett stood tall, his presence commanding. You wanted them to listen, Cam, he said, his voice calm but full of meaning. Let's make sure they do. Cameron's pulse thundered in his ears. He wasn't sure what was about to happen, but one thing was certain. Brookdale Middle School was about to remember the name Bennett. The thump, thump, thump of rotor blades sent a powerful vibration through the air as the black helicopter touched down on Brookdale Middle School's football field. Inside the school, chaos erupted. Students rushed to the windows, phones already out, recording the unbelievable sight. "Is that a helicopter?" one kid gasped. "Dude, it's landing on our field." Teachers shouted for students to return to their seats, but no one was listening. Then the helicopter door swung open. Out stepped Walter Bennett. Dressed in a navy suit, silver hair neatly combed, he carried himself with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step aside. Behind him, Cameron followed, gripping his backpack tightly, heart pounding in his chest. At the field's edge, security guards hesitated, uncertain of how to respond. This wasn't something covered in their training. But Walter didn't stop. He walked straight toward the school like he owned it. Principal Douglas Harper had barely taken his seat when his secretary, Mrs. Dunlap, rushed in, looking pale. "Sir, there's a helicopter on the football field," she stammered. Harper blinked. "Excuse me." Before she could answer, the deep, rhythmic vibration filled the air. The windows shook. The coffee cup on his desk trembled. Harper rushed to the window, his stomach dropped. A black helicopter. A tall, powerful man in a suit. And Cameron Bennett. A knot of dread formed in his chest. He knew exactly who Walter Bennett was, and he knew this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. By the time Walter Bennett entered the front office, the entire school was buzzing with whispers. Teachers peeked out of their classrooms. Students exchanged excited glances. Standing near the principal's door, Mr. Caldwell's arms were crossed, his face set in a scowl. Harper forced a neutral expression. "Mr. Bennett, this is unnecessary." Walter walked right past him, straight into the office, and sat down. "Close the door, Douglas," he said calmly. Harper hesitated. "Now," Walter added. The principal swallowed hard and shut the door. Walter's presence alone dominated the room. He tapped a finger on the desk. "Let's talk about why my grandson was sent home for knowing more than the man teaching him." Caldwell stiffened. "Mr. Bennett, Cameron was disrupting my class." Walter held up a hand. "Did every student in that class challenge your lesson?" Caldwell hesitated. "No." "Did more than one?" A long pause. "No," Caldwell admitted. Walter leaned forward slightly. "So just my grandson, then?" Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Yes." Walter let the silence settle. "Douglas," Walter turned to Harper, "do you always suspend students for correcting misinformation?" Harper cleared his throat. "Mr. Bennett, we follow standard disciplinary." Walter cut him off. "No, you don't." His voice was calm but sharp as a blade. "This wasn't about discipline, this was about control." He glanced at Caldwell. "You didn't like that Cameron challenged you. Instead of acting like an educator, you acted like a man who didn't like being proven wrong." Caldwell's face flushed red. "That's not," Walter raised a brow. "Careful now." Silence. Harper shifted uncomfortably. He saw the trap closing in. Walter exhaled. "Here's what's going to happen next. 1. Cameron goes back to class immediately without a disciplinary mark on his record." Harper nodded slowly. "We can arrange that." Walter lifted a second finger. 2. Both of you, he turned to Caldwell, will apologize to my grandson, publicly. Caldwell grimaced. "That's unnecessary," Walter shrugged. "Then I'll have to call the school board and maybe a few reporters. You ever seen what happens when a school tries to silence a black student for telling the truth?" Harper stiffened. Caldwell swallowed hard. The silence stretched until Caldwell, face tight with resentment, finally muttered, "Fine." Harper adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "Cameron, we shouldn't have rushed to judgment. I apologize." Caldwell's hands clenched. His pride burned as he forced out the words. "Cameron, I'm sorry." Walter clapped his hands together. "Good. Now that we've settled that," he stood, towering over them. "I'll be keeping an eye on this school. If anything like this happens again, I won't be coming alone." Harper's brows furrowed. "Is that a threat?" Walter smirked. "Nah." He adjusted his cuffs. "It's a promise." Turning to Cameron, he placed a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, boy, let's get you back to class." As they stepped out of the office, the entire school was watching. And Cameron, for the first time, he knew he had won. Cameron walked back into the classroom, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The room fell into an awkward silence as heads turned toward him. This time, though, it wasn't curiosity or amusement in their eyes. It was respect. Some students nodded at him, not because he was cool or popular, but because he had stood up for the truth and didn't back down. Cameron met their gazes without hesitation, his confidence unshaken. At the front of the room, Mr. Caldwell stood stiffly by his desk, his jaw tight, his posture tense. He didn't say anything as Cameron took his seat. He didn't need to, because everyone in that room knew what had just happened. The lesson carried on, but Cameron could feel it. Something had shifted. He had proven his point, and for the first time, he wasn't just another student. He was proof that standing up for what's right could shake the whole system. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the farm as Cameron stood next to his grandfather, watching the helicopter lift off once again. Walter adjusted his cufflinks, looking down at his grandson with an amused smirk. "So," he said, voice steady. "What did you learn today, boy?" Cameron smirked. "That when people underestimate me, that's their mistake, not mine." Walter chuckled, clapping Cameron on the back. "Smart boy." As the helicopter disappeared into the sky, Cameron realized something. Today wasn't just about him. It was about every kid who had ever been told to sit down and be quiet. And today, for all of them, he made sure they were heard. Never let someone silence you when you know you're right. True power isn't about arguing louder. It's about making sure they have no choice but to listen. Knowledge isn't just power. It's a weapon. And the smartest people, they know exactly when to use it. Sometimes, the best way to fight back isn't with words, but with a statement they can't ignore. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you were right but weren't taken seriously? Drop your story in the comments and let's talk about it.